Welcome to the Disability News Report. I'm your host, Jennifer Price. Research has shown that youth anxiety has increased, and the reasons have really been varied. From social media to internal pressures to get into the right school, youth today have an increased level of anxiety. My guest, Professor Joseph Davis, is a sociologist at the University of Virginia, and he postulates that the reasons for this anxiety could be something a little bit more that really can't be cured with medication. I'll talk to him about his research and new book, Chemically Imbalanced Everyday Suffering, Medication, and Our Troubled Quest for Self-Mastery. Coming up after this. Welcome to the show, Professor Davis. How are you?
Oh, I'm fine, Jennifer. Thank you.
Great. So I just want to tell you I'm very excited about talking about this topic. As a special education attorney, I certainly see a lot of diagnoses of anxiety, whether that's the sole diagnosis or whether it's coexisting with another disability. And then having raised my own child, daughter, and I have a son, I know what you're referring to in the first article that I read about the deeper roots of youth anxiety when we're talking about these pressures and whether that's really the source of youth anxiety. So just to kind of jump right into it, I was always under the understanding and belief, and I think it's always been put out there that youth anxiety is on the rise. We all know that. But the reasons for that have been anything from social media to the school shootings and now the drills that schools undergo. But you suggest, as well as high stakes testing. I mean, we're coming off the heels of the lawsuit, or the prosecution out there for USC. But you suggest that the rise in youth anxiety may not be as black and white as just pointing the finger at those issues, that it could be something else more related. You suggest, how childhood itself has been reconfigured. And one of the things that you talk about would be obstacles. And children are always coming up on obstacles, but you suggest that children are taught obstacles are variables that can be moderated or eliminated by their hard work and creative efforts. That's certainly a belief system I have subscribed to. I think many people, parent-wise especially, have subscribed to that, and certainly tell our kids, look, jump over that wall, crawl underneath, go around. So why do you feel like that's not the case? It's not
Well,
it's not as simple as that.
yeah. Well, I mean, it can be, I guess. I think what I have found in interviewing, I'm a sociologist, not a psychologist. And so my interviews with young people, and these have been mainly some high school, but principally college students, who again are a particular population, and so um, are under somewhat different pressure, say, than kids who are either of that age but not in college. Um, uh, so I don't want to make too many generalizations, but it seemed like when in talking with those students, what they describe, and many had been diagnosed with attention deficit, with depression, with social anxiety or generalized anxiety, or who I interviewed kids who didn't have any of those diagnoses but had a lot of the very same kinds of experiences, same kinds of struggles with feeling overwhelmed and anxious. And the things that they spoke about were not so much what you might think of as like tangible problems, like fear of a school shooting or something like that, um, or resources, or kind of immediate things like that that people might be anxious about or fearful of, but rather things that had to do with themselves, with their very self. This, for instance, not living up to their potential. This is a common thing that parents communicate. I'm working on a new book, and the interviews we did with parents talk like this all the time. They just want their child to live up to their potential. And that's well meant. Who doesn't want someone to live up to their potential? The problem is, I think what kids hear from that is that what you're asking them to be is very successful. Potential is not a language of limits; it's a language of overcoming obstacles and things like that. And so, what they shared, or what they found really difficult, was that they were um, asked to be successful, and a lot of these college kids are very successful, but they're judging what success is by comparing it to other people, other peers, other people in their environment, right? And then when they begin to struggle, right, it turns out they're not the brightest kid in the room, like maybe they were in high school, and now they're surrounded by kids, all of whom were in the gifted track and that sort of thing. And then, and so then they feel inadequate. They're not like living up to their potential and so on. And they can't understand that. But there's this idea, and I'm coming around to your question, um, that that in some ways there's one that they have a kind of unlimited potential, right? Again, there, as I said in the article you quote, there is no blood test for potential. How do you know when you're living up to your potential, right? I ask, if you ask yourself that question, I ask myself that question, I won't be able to give the answer. I don't know, right? What's my potential? How would I know that? Right? You do different things, and a lot of it, though, we operate within the limits of our environment. A lot of our life is not really chosen, right? It's given to us in certain kinds of circumstances, and we try to work within those, and so on. But again, I think a little bit of this language of potential is that there are no real obstacles that should or could stand in your way, and I think that's not true. We all face obstacles. We all have limits. We all have uh, 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 things in our life uh, that limit what we can and can't do. And it's not that we shouldn't try hard or seek toward excellence and so on, but it does seem to me that the idea that there are no limits or there are no obstacles to limits does put kids in a position where they can't explain failure. They can't even understand it, right? If I'm not living up to my potential, if I'm not in some sense the best, then something is wrong, and right, and then it often came back that somehow they're the person who's failing. In my book, I quote Soren Kierkegaard, who was a philosopher in the mid 19th century, and wrote a lot about anxiety, and he connects anxiety very much to the sort of conception of freedom. But the thing he says about and he uses the idea of despair, that when we despair, we don't we despair of something, and what we despair of is not that we didn't uh, reach our accomplishments, but we despair of the person or of the self who didn't reach those accomplishments, right? So it has a way. So I think this anxiety is a sense that I'm not the person who has unlimited potential, and that in some ways is the crucial core of the anxiety. Not just that I'm not getting A's or I'm doing less, but that somehow it reflects back on me as a certain kind of person that in the college here around here they sometimes refer to as effortless perfection.
Mm-hmm.
That we should be somehow effortlessly perfect, and if we're not, then somehow something's wrong. And anyway, maybe I've said too much, but uh, that's the idea.
Well, I wonder then if it sounds like maybe part of it goes to what our definition of success is, or maybe what we're telling kids the definition of success is. I know, for instance, when I was listening to you, it definitely reminded me of things dealing with our daughter for a number of different things. I mean, certainly she started out in college thinking that she was going to go be a doctor. She ended up changing her major, but one of the reasons that she said she wanted to be a doctor was not because she really and truly wanted to be a doctor, but because she felt obligated to have some high powered career. Because I'm an attorney, my husband's a financial advisor. She had a cousin who was interested in going to med school, and so she felt like that was what she needed to do and be or go to school to be like a doctor or lawyer or something like that in order to feel measured up. So I definitely heard
Right,
you when
right.
you said that other kids are comparing themselves to people and then using that as the sort of measurement of success. So then I
Right.
wonder if it does come back to the definition of success and then what we are um, directly or indirectly teaching children as to what that looks like. Because
Yeah.
then I think about when she played basketball, we would say, look, you don't have to make every single shot or you don't have to block every single shot, but, can you at least try? And if you get out there and you don't make any shots or you don't block any shots, can you say in the end that you at least tried your best? And because we wanted to make sure that she understood we didn't necessarily see her as a failure if she didn't do all of that, but she needs to reconsider thinking whether her effort or lack of effort was more of a contributing factor to why she didn't get the results that she may have wanted.
Right, right, right. Yeah, and that's a very good question. And I think I found that is that typically there wasn't a specific content to success,
Mm-hmm.
at least in the sense that parents, for instance, didn't typically tell their child that they should be a doctor or a lawyer or, right, in some sense, fill in, right. Again, if you think of the language of potential or the related phrase to be all you can be, um, as so it was the idea was that you should just be really successful at whatever it was you did.
Okay.
So what you did was kind of up to you. I did interview kids who have said things like, my parents really want me to be like a doctor,
Mm-hmm.
right? And but that turned out not to be that difficult to deal with. It was interesting. Kids who felt pressure from a parent to be a specific kind thing, like a doctor, for instance, and then decided, say, in college, like that's not working out, or I flunked organic chemistry, um, and then said, well, actually, what I found my passion. I want to be a journalist. Then they talked to their parents, and that usually seemed to go really well. Um, the parent, and this is a little bit of an immigrant phenomena too. So recent immigrants, Asian immigrants, you tended to find a little bit more of that, where the parents had specific and communicated very specific expectations for careers.
Yeah.
But then when that it didn't go that way, and I think in most of the cases I interviewed, the kid was no longer on that, intended to be whatever the parent wanted him to be. That didn't seem so hard. The harder thing was this more amorphous kind of be all you can be, which doesn't exactly have a content. And that's part of why I think it can be anxiety producing is like,
Mm-hmm.
how do you know if you're doing it?
Yeah.
How do you know if you're being successful? And, I'd say, Jennifer, a lot of the bottom line here is the way in which, maybe make a distinction between something like success and excellence. Um, right? So I'm a big advocate of excellence, right? Let's say you're going to play the piano and you have some gift to do that, all right? I'm all in favor of having the child work really hard to gain excellence at it, to play it really well. Not necessarily make a career out of it or anything like that, but just learn something, right? Or education, right? Learning and so on. Doing the work we do, your work, say, as an attorney, or my work as a professor, to do it well,
Mm-hmm.
to do it by a standard of excellence.
Mm-hmm.
That may or may not be rewarded in some sense, right? One could be an excellent player and not win competitions, or even enter, or even be involved in those kinds of things. Um, I think what's happened as part of our I don't know what to call it, kind of our meritocratic ideal, is that it's not enough to be good at something. You have to succeed in some tangible way that you can show, or that you can almost, like, you can measure, you can put on a resume, right? You
Yeah,
have to
that's what
kind
I
of
was just getting ready to say. I think society would question how successful or how excellent you are if you have not received any rewards for playing the piano.
right, right. So in effect, you have to kind of pursue them, and
Yeah.
and of course that then takes a lot of the point of the thing out of it. In a sense, not always. It can't. It doesn't have to, but it does seem to me once you begin to instrumentalize, how can I make my playing the piano achieve some other goal, like my resume or getting me into college or doing these other things? It does seem to me it begins to reduce the point in some ways of doing it, right? So it becomes an end to something else rather than the enjoyment of the thing, which I think often drains a lot of the joy out of children's experience, right? They don't really enjoy things. It's remarkable to me, college kids I interview, how little they really enjoy college. They love parties, right? And they love the student experience,
Yeah.
but the classroom part of it, the actual studying, I mean, it's striking how few read anything once they're not in class. I don't mean class material, but like read other books, right? There's a huge gap between their academic life and then there's their social life. These two just don't even meet. And it's really interesting. And I think, well, something's wrong with that, right? Because it's like somehow the excellence, what they're learning, is not a source for them of wanting to do more, of deepening their interest, of their love of learning. We're not fostering that somehow, and I think that's part of instrumentalizing. And so there's one sense in which success is, if you will, not kind of excellence, but some kind of tangible, provable thing, something you can put on your Facebook page, something you can put on your resume, something that can help. I think those kinds of so it's not just success in a certain sense, but a kind of accomplishments or something. These kind of tangible accomplishments, and I think that's my sense for what gives people a lot of anxiety is that they want to play the piano, but then they start getting entered in competitions and things, and again again our society is a little bit of a winner take all.
Yes.
So who won,
Yep.
and then who finished second is like nobody even talks about it, right?
No one remembers
And
second place.
so it's very demotivating, and again I think kind of anxiety or depression inducing is that you don't really you can't pursue these kind of human goods just in their own way. So anyway, I'd say that's something relevant to the question of success, and what about pursuing success creates anxiety, right? And I think it's this competitive element to it, and that takes a lot of the joy out of it, and then makes one kind of constantly feel like one isn't good enough. The ways to feel inadequate, it seems to me, just keep multiplying.
For sure.
Yeah.
Well, and so you're a professor at UVA, and I'm not sure whether your interviews were other students solely at UVA or other D1 institutions, but is there, because for instance in the blog that I read, the blog article that I read, you referenced a girl first named Megan who
Yeah.
went to a safe school, what she called a safe school, but was still, according to the article, a top-rate university. So I'm just wondering if that comparison of the safe school versus the reach school or whatever, and the anxiety within students, the college students that you interviewed, had anything to do with where they went to school. For instance, does anxiety show itself in students no matter what university they're in, or is it more prevalent in students at UVA or Harvard versus another university?
Right. Well, certainly there's a big difference, but I think that it tends to you kind of scale yourself, if you will, to where you're at, to what you see as your reference group. So Megan went to an academy, right, that where a lot of the kids went to the Ivy League, and so on. And her first choice was Stanford, right? Again, a highly competitive sort of place. And then And I've met students who went to the University of Chicago,
Yeah.
but didn't get into Princeton and feel less somehow because of that. So I think people will kind of gear themselves to to a reference group, and so if your friends or the kids that you kind of compare yourself go to sort of certain kind of elite institutions, then that will be your reference point. Though it's striking, we did interviews or a survey with parents and one of their kids from the same family. So we have interview with parents, and one of the things we asked kids was not only how many would aspire to go to college, but how many aspire to go to a top college, right? A highly ranked college, right?
Right.
And about 20% said it's absolutely essential that they go to a top college. So it isn't just so that seems kind of a broad-based thing. Uh, and I think there is certainly a class difference, social class difference. Um, Again, in terms of kind of the aspirations. However, anxiety rates are just as high among kids who don't go to college as those who do. Um, so I think a lot of these same pressures are in operation, but people kind of scale themselves differently, right? What their aspirations are might not to be the CEO of the corporation, but they might be to do certain kinds of work or to be a YouTube star or something like that,
Right.
and then feel inadequate because they're not in uh, the, the the elite circle, and so on. So yeah, I do think there's this kind of scaling to different aspirations, but some of the same anxiety over not being able to meet aspirations, falling short.
Well, and one of your interviews was of a high school senior who commented that when um, the measure of success was to be able to walk into a cafeteria and have everyone know who you are. And they stated it doesn't even necessarily matter how many people you as the senior know other people in the cafeteria, but how many people actually know you when you walk into the room. And failing to do so can bring some level of shame and humiliation. So
Yeah,
I'm wondering whether, especially because all of this has changed over the years, and kind of thinking also about what you said with YouTube, and it's all relative to where you are. It's not necessarily predominant in one socioeconomic household over another. How much does media or even reality TV play into this sort of instant fame, so to speak, and popularity
right, right.
contest?
Yeah, yeah, right. Well, I think we talked a little bit about, kind of living up to your potential, kind of optimizing yourself, right, and a certain pressure to kind of constantly perform. But another one, and it's related but somewhat separate, is what you might call the pressure to stand out, to be unique, not to be general, not even to be normal. I had one young woman say to me, I don't want to be normal, right? That's like boring. I want to be above average. I want to stand out. And I think the high school girl, I was talking with her, the young woman, her point was that, right, you need to stand out. You need to, right, demonstrate special, something special,
Right.
right, to be special, right? And it's interesting in interviewing parents, how many talk about how special their child is, how even awesome they are, how proud they are to be the parent of this 5-year-old, and that kind of talk, and and I think it's reflective of a broader thing in our society that emphasizes the singular over the general,
Mm.
the particular, the authentic, the right, again, kind of the winner, not the loser, not the second place, right, and so on, and that is a kind of unique pressure, I think, that kids feel to have. I was talking with another young man. He was a freshman in college, and he told me that at the high school he went to through his junior year, so he quit it after his junior year. When you were a senior, at the time you graduated, you had to get up in front of like 200 people and give a little 5-minute talk on yourself. And he was absolutely terrified of having to do this. It was like a TED talk on yourself and how you stood out, what was unique about you, how you were different, what your, and your sort of ambitions and all that sort of stuff. And again, I think, at 18, I mean, who the hell knows?
Right. Right.
Right. I mean, most of us ended up in lines of work that were completely, I went back to graduate school in my 30s and became a professor after other things and so on. So this idea, but anyway, so I think that pressure to stand out, to distinguish yourself. It's striking how many young people, when asked what they want to be, will say an influencer, a social media influencer. The Lego Corporation last year with the Harris poll, and it was on the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11. They had a thing about astronauts, and they did a poll, and then they also were doing these little programs and bringing kids to like NASA facilities and things like that. Anyway, when they asked the kids how many wanted to be astronauts, it was about 10%. 30% wanted to be social media influencers. Okay, they don't want to go on the moon; they want to be social media influencers.
Yes.
And I think that hints at this kind of like that you'll be somebody unique with some kind of unique style that other people will want to follow or envy, and that somebody will actually pay you money to kind of state your like your fashion sense or whatever the kind of influence you hope to do, etc. So, in fact, one little other point, I was just reading about this Varsity Blues scandal.
Oh.
So this is those parents who hired this guy to like fake that their children were athletes in order to get accepted into Southern Cal and Georgetown and several places like that. And one of them was this actress, Lori Loughlin, and who hasn't yet been sentenced, but I think has now pleaded guilty. But her daughter, she has like three daughters, I guess. I'm sorry, I didn't know any of this till I was reading about it. She has a daughter who's like a big social media star,
Right.
right? She's really beautiful, and I don't know what's her thing is, but it was like, but it appears that her parents wanted her to go to college, right? And she was already, being somebody, but not really the somebody perhaps that they were hoping for or whatever.
Right.
And and so on. But I think anyway, all I'm saying is that there is, I think, this pressure to be singular, to kind of stand out from the crowd, to not blend in, not be a part of the herd. I think this is an important difference. The older psychological language for raising kids was one of the parental duties was to help your kid adjust.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It was actually to bring them in and help them mature, right? And so on. Those were all concepts that had to do with fitting in, right? Not standing out, but fitting in, and learning the social rules and how to be a good citizen and so on. And they don't really talk like that anymore. Parents certainly don't talk like that anymore.
No.
What they talk about is how they can draw out, in some sense, from their child to help them reach their full potential and find the thing that they're especially good in. And parents, practically every parent would say, "Oh, you can't treat any two kids the same way."
Right.
Right? Each child is a unique, and so you have to kind of. And again, I'm not saying that's always bad. It's just, but I think it reflects something like a social change that puts an important emphasis on being unique, about standing out, finding your unique thing,
Yeah.
assuming we all have one.
Right. Yes. Right. And then comes the lifetime
I mean, most
learning,
of us
trying
are
to
just
figure out what
average.
that is.
Yeah. Right,
Oh,
right.
well, I certainly appreciate the interview, Professor Davis, author of
Oh, yeah.
Biochemically Imbalanced